Greetings, media theory people. It is Dr. Clayby here again with another short video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about another admittedly difficult reading, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction by Walter Benjamin. But before we get started, I do want to take a moment just to briefly remind you that over the course of the semester, you're required to submit a total of 10 written abstracts based on the weekly readings. You cannot submit any more than 2 abstracts per week. And when you submit them, they should be in Word or Google Doc format and sent to my eclayba1@gsu.edu email. The great majority of you have already begun this, but if you haven't, maybe now's the time to start. We're already 5 weeks into the semester, surprisingly. Time flies when you're having fun. And I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to get in what they need to get in. If you have any questions about the assignment, as always, feel free to email me. Okay, so with that said, let's get into the work of art in Walter Benjamin. So Benjamin was a Frankfurt School affiliated scholar, so not technically a member of the Frankfurt School like Adorno and Horkheimer, the folks that we read last time, but nevertheless is affiliated with the Frankfurt School and communicated with many of the scholars there on a consistent basis regarding his work. So Benjamin lived from 1892 to 1940. And the reason that we read the work of art is that it's one of the very first essays to identify the revolutionary impact of new technologies, specifically mechanical reproduction, in the 20th century on the status of the work of art. So what Benjamin is discussing here has to do with this whole issue of modernity that I've talked about throughout the semester. So he's writing during the first half of the 20th century, and he's interested specifically in art and what it means that art is now able to be reproduced with great efficiency and distributed with great efficiency. Obviously, this was not the case, at least not in the same way, prior to Benjamin's time. And so he's looking at this and he's saying, well, what does it mean now that art can, anyone can get art, that it comes to them in a sense, that it's not as isolated in a sense as it once was, right? So you don't have to go to a museum or more likely a church or a cathedral to see art anymore. It's all around you. It comes to you, right, in ways that it never did before. And so Benjamin is trying to figure out what does this mean, right? What does this mean to the status of art in this time of new technology in this new century? So he begins then by tracing this history of artistic reproduction. And he says, listen, man-made artifacts could always be reproduced, but mechanical reproduction is something new. And by mechanical reproduction, he meant things like the printing press, right, or especially the steam-powered or automated printing press, where you could just crank out, book after book after book, or print after print after print. Again, it's about a new kind of technology and how it unsettles the status of art, or the status that art held previously. And so he goes through this history, right? He talks about the Greeks and their use of founding and stamping. He talks about woodcuts as a form of reproduction, again, not mechanized. He talks about engraving and etching in the Middle Ages, lithography in the 19th century, and then photography, which ultimately gives way to movies, to moving pictures. And he comments on the idea now that photographic images move as quickly as speech, which I think is an interesting kind of way to think about it. But clearly, our ability to communicate using these different media is vastly different than it was even a century before the time that Benjamin writes this. So again, he's trying to figure out what all this means, and he just sort of traces the history to get started. So he gets to the meat of the subject pretty quick. He says, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space. So what he means by this, again, and I realize this is sort of hard to interpret, but what he means by this is that when we reproduce an artwork, even make a forgery, let's say, what it doesn't have, that the original artwork has, is a certain kind of existence, presence in both time and space. So it's made during a particular time, under particular circumstances, this original is, right? And it's located in a particular space. So, for example, during the middle of the 16th century, the Catholic Church folks got together at the Council of Trent, and they decided that they needed to spend a lot of the church's money on making really elaborate kinds of artwork. And the reason they wanted to do this was because it was a way to create awe in the masses, right? They referred to it as the propagation of awe. So the idea is you'd go to church and you'd see this beautiful artwork and you'd say, oh man, this is amazing. And it gives their message more weight, more power. And they wanted to do this specifically because they were challenged by the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, right? Who was telling people, become literate, read your Bible, and you'll find that the message in the Bible is not the same one that the Catholic Church is telling you. And so the Catholic Church countered this by saying, let's make really beautiful artwork. So as a consequence, the artwork, things like Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa, for example, these are magnificent artworks that are really technical marvels that are meant to inspire awe in people. And they were placed with very precise kinds of lighting, natural lighting, of course, at the time, but with very precise kinds of lighting in very precise locations in churches and cathedrals, so that when people came in to worship, they'd see them. And if you wanted to see this kind of great art, you had to travel to the cathedral to see it. It didn't come to you in the same way that art comes to us today, right? And we'll talk about this more as we go on. But today, I think about any kind of art, music, books, films, TV shows, these things come to you now. It used to be that you had to go somewhere to engage with them, right? And that location, for example, in a very prominent place in a church, is part of what gives that original work of art its authenticity and its power. Moreover, its presence in time helps give it that power. We know now when we look at the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, when we look at that sculpture, we understand why it was created and under what context and what circumstances. And that context imbues the artwork, again, with a certain kind of authenticity that we don't get if we just send it out to everybody, right? So the presence, he says, of the original is the prerequisite to the concept of authenticity. So again, what he's talking about here is its presence in time and space, and how this is a key element of its authenticity. And it's authenticity which gives it its power, right? I mean, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about why, if you buy a fake painting, if you couldn't tell the difference, it's still worth less? Well, why is that the case, right? I mean, if people can't distinguish the difference between a copy and the original, then in theory, the copy should be worth just as much, right? But it's not. And the reason it isn't is because, in part, of what Benjamin is talking about here. The presence of the original, its location in time and space, which, of course, relates to its authenticity. So, and we'll get into it more a little bit later, but when Benjamin talks about the aura, which is a difficult kind of concept to grasp in many ways, but when he talks about the aura, what he's talking about is this thing, right? The authenticity, the power of the artwork, and specifically its presence in time and space. So here's an example, right? Benjamin talks about the presence, again, of the artwork in time and space and its unique existence. Well, here we see it, right? Here's the Mona Lisa in the Louvre in Paris. right? The real deal. And obviously, this work has tremendous importance, right? I mean, it wouldn't be displayed the way it is. You have to stand back here. You can't get too close to it, lest you mess it up in some way or try and touch it. Uh, then of course it's boxed within this UV glass over here that prevents the sun's rays from degrading it, and also prevents people from throwing things at it and so on, right? I mean, its location in this museum, in its own room, right, and displayed in this dramatic fashion. That all this gives the work its authenticity in a sense. It gives it an aura, right? It grants the work its power in a way. And of course, if you want to see it, you have to get up and buy a ticket to Paris and fly over there and gain entry into the Louvre and then go see it. When you take the artwork out of that realm through reproduction, it loses some of that power, right? I mean, obviously, my example here is kind of on the nose. I mean, literally, you're wiping your butt here with the Mona Lisa, but you understand. I think it makes the point that the reproduction is of vastly less value than the original. And part of the reason for that, again, has to do with its authenticity, the context under which it was created, and where it's located, how we engage with it, right? Because the location influences the way you engage with it. This is even true about movies, right? This is one of the things that directors complain about with streaming, right? The idea that people are watching movies on their phones. Well, you know as well as I do that they're right to some extent, that watching a movie on your phone is a vastly different experience than watching it at IMAX, let's say. One, you have to get up and buy a ticket and go and be there at a specific time at a specific place to watch the movie. The scale is much different. You're experiencing it with an audience, which makes it different, right? But when it comes to you, when it just shows up on your phone and you can watch it, I don't know, when you're bored, sitting on your couch or in your dorm room, the experience is very different. And indeed, it lacks that aura that Benjamin is talking about. This mass reproduction degrades the aura, in a sense, then. So what he's talking about, then, with aura also has to do with authority, right? The authority of the work. And Benjamin says, confronted with its manual reproduction, which was usually branded as forgery, the original preserved all its authority. This is not so with regard to technical reproduction. So again, this authority is related to aura, which is related to its location in time and space, and its originalness, right? Its authenticity. So what he's saying here is that even when you have a forgery, specifically a handmade forgery of a great painting like the Mona Lisa, let's say we had a forgery instead of the toilet paper, the Mona Lisa still maintains all its original authority. This isn't the case with technical reproduction, right? So, for example, this is one of the problems with NFTs, right? The idea that they're trying to make a digital image more authentic, to grant a digital image, digital information, to grant it an aura, which arguably it doesn't have, right? Because one NFT is the same as another NFT, right? One digital picture is the same as the next digital picture. The original is no more or less important, right? They're all the same. It's just ones and zeros, just information. So you see that when we reproduce things technically, as opposed to reproducing things through manual reproduction, the original, if anything, the original is worth less, right? So, Benjamin says there's two reasons for this. The first one is that mechanical reproduction is more independent of the original. So, if we hand copy a painting, that hand copy is deeply, deeply dependent on the original, right? You have to sit there and look at the original. You have to be really careful in examining it to create it so that people can't tell that it's a forgery and so on. With mechanical reproduction, I can stamp out as many lithographs, for example, as I want, just one after the other, and they're all the same, right? The first one doesn't really matter. It's just one of many, right? So the second reason that he says that this happens is that mechanical reproduction can put the copy of the originals into situations which would be out of reach for the original. So what he's saying here is that the copy, like I said earlier, under mechanical reproduction, the copy comes to you. You know, you don't have to go to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa once it's been mechanically reproduced because, you know, it came to you. It's in your bathroom. You can wipe your ass with it. So this is part of what Benjamin sees as a tendency of modern culture, right? This idea of bringing things closer to us. So just to riff a little bit more on his idea of it being independent of the original, he says, first, processed reproduction is more independent of the original than manual reproduction. So what he's saying here is what he just said on the last slide. But then he goes on. He says, for example, in photography, processed reproduction can bring out those aspects of the original that are unattainable to the naked eye, yet accessible to the lens. Okay, so he's saying a couple things here, right? The first one is that photography, when you think about it, is based solely on mechanical reproduction, or technical reproduction in the case of digital images. So photography is designed as a medium. Its essence, part of its essence, is this idea that you can crank out as many photographs as you want. Clearly, this is different than a painting, let's say, where it's really hard to crank them out. And if you are going to make a copy of a painting, you have to pay really close attention to the first one to give it the level of detail you want, right? With a photograph, it doesn't work this way. With a photograph, you just crank them, crank them, crank them. And indeed, they're not dependent on the original because you could blow up an image to see details, for example, on a copy that you never even saw in the original, right? So you see the copy, in a way, is possibly worth even more. So it's independent, right? I mean, photography is by itself a medium that is different than painting. You can never capture this image, for example, in an oil painting by watching it occur in real life, right? I mean, you could guess what a bullet going through an apple looks like and paint that, but it's not the same, you see, right? So here, this shows you, in a sense, how different photography is by its very nature, because it's, you know, in part because of its ability to be mechanically reproduced, but also just by the nature of the medium itself. It can capture time in a way that we can't with painting, for example. As we see catching a bullet in flight. So again, mechanical reproduction removes the artwork from its location in time and space. Art comes to you. A good example is music. If you wanted to go hear classical music, you have to go to the symphony, right? You have to go to this special place at this special time with all these other people and listen. But with mechanical reproduction, the music comes to you, right? As we see in this old, what is it, Maxwell tape ad, I think, right? This was an ad for cassette tapes back in the day when I was a kid. But you see here, right, that the guy's listening to music, and in a sense, he's getting this, maybe the same, they want to suggest it's the same kind of experience as having your socks blown off at the actual symphony, right? Because you see his hair blown back and, you know, all the effects of him listening to this music coming out of the speaker. But it makes the point that it comes to you. Again, this is, we see this today in streaming with films. You know, you don't have to go to the movies anymore. I'm pretty sure Top Gun 2 is still in a bunch of theaters, but I can rent it for $4.95 right now and stream it in my living room. And so what does that do? What does it do to the art that is uh, Top Gun 2, if that's art? And I think it probably is. What does it do to that art that I can stream it and I don't have to go through the cultural ritual of going to the movies and sitting with people I don't know in a dark theater at a specific time and place and share this experience with others? Right? What does that mean? That's what Benjamin is getting at. So then again, he talks about aura throughout this whole thing, and I remember the first time I read this, and I thought, what the hell is the aura of a work of art? What does this really mean? And so when Benjamin writes about aura, he's really writing about two things. In one sense, he's writing about the authority. Now, we've talked about this, the authority, the authenticity held by the original work of art, which is all tied up in issues regarding its location in time and space, its history, and more broadly, its authenticity. So again, this is what I've talked about thus far, about the original being made at a specific time, about the idea that it's only available to be seen or heard in a specific place, right? That's one half of it. The other half that he's writing about here is a certain kind of intersubjective experience, meaning that, when you going to see a work of art, for example, in a museum, when you do this, right, it's a different kind of experience than if you're just looking at it, for example, on your computer screen, right? There's kind of what we call an intersubjective experience, where you're regarding the artwork, and in a sense, the artwork's regarding you, right? The art's staring back at you. There's this like, whoa, kind of factor where you come across it in real life. And Benjamin says, well, what mechanical reproduction does to art is it destroys the aura, it degrades the aura. And that indeed the reproduction of original artworks oftentimes degrades the original itself, right? So further, in some forms of mechanical art, like photography, no aura exists at all, right? Because it's made to be technically reproduced. So when I think about this intersubjective experience, I think about this painting. The name of this painting is Prometheus Bound. It's by Rubens. And it depicts the fate of the god Prometheus, or the demigod, I guess, Prometheus, after he stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind, right? This is an ancient Greek myth. So Prometheus goes and he steals fire from the gods. They were the only ones who had it. He steals fire from the gods and he gives it to people so that they can have fire and cook their food and stay warm and all this stuff. And so Zeus, punishes him by having him chained to a rock where a huge bird comes and eats out his liver. Now, because Prometheus is a god, his liver regenerates. And so this happens every day, forever. Right? That's his punishment. And this is Rubens' depiction of that punishment. And the painting itself is huge. It's got to be 6 foot tall, right? It's really big. And so as a young boy, this hangs in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I grew up in Philadelphia. And my father, I remember when he took me to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I saw this for the first time. They have it so that you come around a corner and you're confronted by this painting. And I was a little boy. I don't know how old I was, maybe 5 or 6. And I can remember to this day this feeling of awe, of just being like, holy shit, right? About just being struck by the aura of this piece of art. Its prominent place in the museum, the way it was displayed, the sheer scale of the artwork, the idea that somehow it did stare back at me in some way, right? Where it just confronted me. Maybe the confrontation is the best way to frame it. Where I come around and I see it and it's like, look at me, right? In your face. And this is the aura, right? And so now I could go and I could buy a mechanical reproduction of this painting at Amazon. Oh my lord. NFG P-E-Y. So I could go and I could buy a reproduction of this on Amazon and look at it. Look how crappy this looks. Look how horrible this is in comparison to the original. You see how it lacks aura? I mean, I think you can see exactly what I'm getting at. Look at the difference between these two. Even here on the screen, I think that you can see the difference. Now, it's important to recognize that when Benjamin is talking about aura, it's impossible to remove this theory from religion. So for Benjamin, the concept of aura is rife with religious connotations. And indeed, I've copied and pasted this, as you can see, from another source, but it says this well, right? It says, they say, it derives its force from ritual and ceremony, elaborate circumscription and arcane knowledge. So this is the work of art, right? The work of art, the original, not a mechanically reproduced work of art, but an original derives its force from ritual and ceremony, elaborate circumscription and arcane knowledge. Prior to the advent of methods of mass reproduction, a work of art was a unique object or performance that could not be experienced except by audience members willing to make a pilgrimage to the artwork's location. And of course, here we see the Sistine Chapel, which is, I mean, my Lord, right? Holy crap. This is stunningly beautiful, awe-inspiring, right? You talk about the propagation of awe, this is it. And we look at this and you can see the aura and you can understand how it's about ritual and ceremony. Could you imagine going to a religious function here, right? It's easy to imagine a God in this context. And that this God somehow has imbued this artwork with value, right? You're not going to get this at home. You're only going to get it in a very special place with people, you know, when it was painted, with people operating there who knew infinitely more than you. Most of the peasants who would come see this couldn't read or write. They couldn't even understand the Mass because it was in Latin. So you go to this place and it's all tied up with religious ritual and God and learning and secret knowledge and all these things. And you look at it, it's, you know, right? And that's where so much of its aura and power comes from, right? The presentation of it. Now, with mechanical reproduction, we substitute originality for plurality, right? For multiple kinds of images. And this is, by the way, what Andy Warhol was playing with in a lot of his art, right? I mean, why 3 Elvises? Why 6 Marilyn Monroes? Well, the answer is that he's playing with this idea of reproduction, right? As well as how we know and experience these people, right? I mean, none of us ever knew Elvis. Not really, right? The vast majority of people, their understanding of Elvis only came from films, from mechanical reproductions, right? And these reproductions gave us a plurality or a multiplicity of Elvises. And the same with Marilyn, right? So in modern culture, we have these kinds of, you know, repeating messages that are all around us. And because they're all around us, because there's this plurality, multiple images, the original has no value, right? You know, one picture of Elvis isn't worth any more than 3. So, as part of this, Benjamin suggests that new technologies and this new experience of mechanical reproduction changes the way we perceive the world and things, the way we think about the world around us. This is a very controversial kind of theory. It's known as the history of vision. It's not on the test, but it's known as the history of vision. The idea is that somehow new technologies, again, change the way that we see the world, the way we make sense of it, right? Not necessarily, they don't literally change your sight, like you don't see things that used to be red as blue, but they change the way you perceive the world, the way you make sense of it, right? And so one of the things that mechanical reproduction symbolizes, I guess, part of this new perception is that the masses in modernity want to bring things closer. They want things to be closer both spatially, they want to be closer to things, physically and humanly. You can think about the church in this way, right? Where you have this one, ordained figure, the priest up on, a pulpit, speaking to a group. He isn't walking among you, right? This is not an egalitarian experience. You're not the same as him. He's better than you. That's why he's up there. And there's a distance, and that distance grants him authority in a sense. It's the same if you go to court, right? You're not allowed. You have to ask to approach the bench, don't you? Have you ever thought about why you have to ask? Well, the answer is you have to ask because it's a way to endow the judge figure with authority. And I got news for you. The judge is just someone just like you and me, right? They're just a human being. And in many cases, more ignorant than many of us, right? I have little time for judges. But again, in modernity, we want to bring things closer. And at the same time, in a way, we kind of want to overcome the uniqueness of our reality by accepting its reproduction. I mean, look at this, right? I mean, this is a classic kind of example. Like, Jesus Christ, we got this wallpaper or whatever, this mural that brings the outside in, right? That makes the outside and nature closer. It takes nature completely out of its context and puts it in a domestic kind of setting, right? Even here in the work of Stanley Kubrick with 2001, we see, right, there's this kind of desire. I should turn down this volume. So even here with Kubrick, right, we see this desire to accept reproduction over reality. Now, Kubrick made this film before we had ever seen images of Earth from outer space, right? He made this before we went to space and went to the moon and got images of Earth. But we're so hungry for it that we accept this fake image, right, instead of reality. And then, of course, technology today brings things, crazy close, right? An example of that would be, something like, let's see, can I get this to work? No, I can't get the link to work, so don't worry about that. So the other thing that Benjamin says about this reproduction, mechanical reproduction, is that it's transitory, right? And inherently reproducible. Mechanical reproduction replaces uniqueness and permanence, a la something like a marble bust, right? That if with minimal care will literally last forever, right? This is replaced with transitoriness and reproducibility. Jesus on black velvet, right? So I can crank these out all day, no problem. If it gets something on it, throw it away. No problem. I can go buy another one. That's not the case with this, right? And of course, you could see the difference in artistic worth and value in these, I would assume. So, when authenticity stops being applicable to artistic production, as it is in mechanical reproduction, Benjamin says the total function of art is reversed. So art in mechanical reproduction isn't based on ritual anymore. And instead it's based on another practice. And that practice for Benjamin is politics. So even though Benjamin is bemoaning the loss of the aura in in artworks and so on. I mean, he thinks this is a bad thing, certainly. He still says, listen, though, when we change it, right, when we change it by making it reproducible in this way, we take it out of the world of ritual and religion. And as a consequence, it can be used politically. So then the upside of the negation of the aura is that it makes way for a radical new form of politics and political expression, right? So art isn't about religion anymore. Now it can be about politics and a radical kind of expression. So you see, I thought it would be interesting here. You know, when we think about ritual, you could think about religious rituals, like as with the Catholic Church, like we've already discussed. But you can also look at these, right? These are cave paintings from Lascaux in France, and these are the oldest representative images we've ever discovered, right? I mean, these things go back forever. I mean, just I don't even know how far, but eons, right? Thousands of years. And you can even see here in this lit up cave, it's kind of lit up the way it would have been with people, you know, lighting a fire and sitting in there the way they would have thousands of years ago. That there's even a ritual kind of component here too. It's about hunting. It's about honoring the hunt. It's about creating images of things that we value so that we can behold them, right? So that we can hold them in our eyes, right? And think about them and make sense of them. This is a ritual kind of artwork, and it goes back to the very first kind of artworks. And of course, then once we take art out of that kind of context, where it's about ritual, it can become political. As with this image from the cover of Paris Match magazine. This is an image that Roland Barthes, the French theorist, examined in his piece entitled Mythologies. And he looks at this and he evaluates the political message of this meaning with this young boy saluting the French tricolor flag, right? And talks about the political messages involved in this. I mean, this is a wildly political image, and it's so different, in a sense, than the sculptures that we see in churches or the Sistine Chapel or even the cave paintings at Lascaux, right? This isn't about ritual anymore. It's about politics, right? Okay, so that kind of wraps up Benjamin. I hope that helped to explain things, and I appreciate you checking out my video. See you next time.